He didn't marry her for warmth. Emmerich von Tano married Vesna to end a war between two families, and in 14 months, he had never once tasted a thing she cooked. Her kitchen was a closed door at the far end of his marble house, a room he passed the way you pass a stranger's grave. Then one sleepless night, chasing a smell that had no business in a house like his, he pushed that door open. What he found at her table made the coldest man in Corvain Bay tear his own empire apart to keep it. The Vantano estate was built to be admired and never touched. Every surface in it was hard. The floors were pale imported marble, veined like something bled dry. The walls were the color of bone. Even the flowers on the great hall table were chosen for their shape and not their scent, orchids. Always orchids, replaced twice a week whether they had wilted or not. Emmerich had designed it that way on purpose. A house that felt like a museum was a house where nothing could hide. He liked being able to hear his own footsteps. At the head of the 18-seat dining table, Emmerich ate alone. The meal in front of him had been prepared by Baptiste, a chef flown in from the capital and paid more than most of Emmerich's soldiers. It was flawless and forgettable. A medallion of veal, arranged like a jewel, a smear of sauce, dragged across the plate with a spoon, 3 microscopic vegetables standing at attention. Emmerich cut it into precise squares and ate without tasting. Food, to him, was fuel and theater, nothing more. A man who let himself love the meal was a man who could be poisoned, and Emmerich intended to die of something he chose. Down the length of the table, past 16 empty chairs, sat his wife. Vesna Vantano was not what the other families had expected him to marry. She was soft where his world was sharp, round-cheeked, wide-hipped, warm-eyed. The kind of woman who took up space without apology and seemed impossibly unafraid of him. His men had smirked behind their hands at the wedding. The Ice King and the Baker's Girl. They had stopped smirking within a week, once they learned what Emmerich did to men who smirked, but they still didn't understand it, and Emmerich never explained. The marriage had bought peace between the Vantano freight lines and the ruined family she came from. That was all it was meant to buy. She was watching him eat. She always did. Baptiste's veal, she said gently, would taste of something if he let it rest before he cut it. Emmerich didn't look up. It tastes of exactly what I pay for. That was the closest thing to conversation they had. 14 months of it. She would offer some small, patient observation about the food, and he would answer with a blade, and she would nod as though he'd said something reasonable, and return to her plate. He had never raised his voice to her. He had simply built a wall of cold politeness and lived behind it, and he assumed she had done the same. He was wrong, but it would be a long time before he learned how wrong. What Emmerich did not eat, what he would not eat, was anything that came from her kitchen. The small room at the end of the west corridor was the one part of his house he had surrendered without a fight. Back when surrendering it seemed like a way to keep her occupied and quiet. She cooked in there. He knew, because the staff whispered about it, and because sometimes, faintly, the sterile air of his home would carry a thread of something impossible through it, garlic blooming in hot oil, cinnamon, and bread. He found the smell offensive the way he found all soft things offensive. It suggested a life he had decided not to want. Every night, without fail, Vesna left a covered dish outside the door of his study. And every night, without fail, Emmerich had it taken away untouched. His men carried the plates to the bins. He never asked what was under the cloth. He told himself it was discipline. He told himself a man who ate from his wife's hand was a man giving her a place to hide a knife. He believed that, the way he believed most convenient things, completely, and without ever once checking. On the night everything changed, he came home late, his knuckles split from a conversation at the docks, and there was no plate outside his study door. For the first time in 14 months, the cloth-covered dish was not there. And Emmerich von Tano stood in the empty corridor, staring at the bare marble where it should have been, and felt, for reasons he could not name, The first cold finger of something that was almost fear. He told himself it meant nothing. A plate was not there. So what? He had thrown away 400 of them. The absence of one should have been a relief, a small surrender on her part, a sign that his wife had finally learned the shape of the wall between them. Emmerich hung his coat, poured 2 fingers of something amber, and sat behind his desk to work. He did not work. He kept looking at the door. It was absurd, and he knew it was absurd, and that made it worse. The most feared man in Corvain Bay, a man whose name made harbor bosses pay their debts a day early, sat in a leather chair at midnight and could not stop glancing at the place on the floor where a covered dish was not sitting. He tried to name the feeling, and couldn't. It wasn't hunger. It was closer to the sensation of a clock that is always ticked in a room, suddenly going silent. You don't notice the sound until it stops. And then the quiet is deafening. At 12:30 he stopped pretending and rang the bell for the nightman. Novak appeared in the doorway, gray at the temples, careful. He had worked the estate longer than Emmerich had run it. "Sir, my wife's dish. It wasn't left tonight." Novak's face did a small, complicated thing. A flinch smoothed over almost before it began. Almost. Emmerich had built a life on almosts. "No, sir. Why not?" The old man chose his words the way a man chooses his footing on ice. "Mrs. Fantano is occupied this evening, sir." "Occupied." Emmerich set down his glass. "It's past midnight." "Yes, sir." "Occupied with what?" And here, Novak did something Emmerich had not seen him do in 11 years of loyal, silent service. He hesitated. He glanced, just once, toward the west corridor, toward the closed door of the kitchen. Emmerich had surrendered and never entered. And then he looked back at his employer with the flat, protective blankness of a man deciding to lie. "I couldn't say, sir." "Couldn't, not don't know." Emmerich heard the difference, the way he heard everything, completely. He dismissed Novak with a small motion of 2 fingers and sat very still after the door closed. Somewhere in his chest, the cold thing turned over again. His wife was awake past midnight, doing something his own nightman would rather lie than name, in a room Emmerich had spent 14 months pretending did not exist. The obvious explanations arrived first, because they always did in his line of work. A message being passed. A meeting. The ruined family she came from, reaching back through her, for leverage, for revenge, for the one soft door he'd left unguarded in a fortress of hard rooms. He had let a stranger live in his house for over a year, and called it a marriage. He did not actually know this woman at all. He knew the shape of her, at the far end of a table. He knew she thought Baptiste didn't rest the veal. He stood. He did not take a gun. Later, this would strike him as the strangest part, that some instinct told him he wouldn't need one. He walked out of his study and down the long marble corridor toward the west wing, his footsteps loud in the silence, exactly as he'd designed them to be. The house smelled of orchids and lemon polish and cold stone. And then, as he reached the last turn before the kitchen, it didn't. The air changed. It grew warmer against his face and thicker, and it carried a smell he had no defense against, because he had spent his whole careful life making sure never to learn it. Butter going golden, bread near the end of its baking, and underneath it all something dark and slow and sweet that reached straight past every wall he owned. Under the kitchen door, a line of warm light glowed against the marble, and from the other side of it came a sound that stopped Emmerich Vantano cold, one hand raised, not yet touching the wood. Voices, more than one, laughing. Emmerich stood with his hand raised, not yet touching the wood, and listened to people laughing in a room inside his own house. He knew every voice that belonged here. He had vetted each one personally, the staff, the guards, the handful of men trusted enough to sleep under his roof. He built his safety out of knowing exactly who was breathing his air at any given hour. And the sounds coming through this door did not fit. There was a woman's low chuckle he recognized as his wife's, though he had never once heard her make it. There was an old man's rasp. There was the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the particular loose warmth of people who are comfortable, people who are safe. Nobody was safe in Amaric's house. That was the entire point of the house. Every instinct he had sharpened over 20 violent years told him the same thing. A stranger was at his table, his own staff was lying to protect it, and his wife, the soft door he'd left unguarded, was in the middle of it. The cold professional in him began assembling the worst version, a contact from her ruined family, a blade being sharpened in the one room he'd been fool enough to cede. He should go back for a gun, he should wake his men. He should do this the careful way, the way that had kept him alive when better men were gone. Instead, he pushed the door open. He would spend a long time afterward trying to understand why. The closest he ever came was this: some part of him, older than his caution, did not want to meet whatever was in that room from behind a barrel. Some part of him wanted to simply see it, undefended, the way you might walk toward a light in the dark, not because it's wise, but because you are tired of the dark. The door swung in on silent hinges, oiled, he noted dimly. Someone kept them oiled, and the warmth hit him first, a wall of it, thick with butter and bread, and that dark, sweet undertone he still couldn't name. The light was gold and low, and every person in the room turned to look at the man in the doorway. There were 5 of them. Not one was a stranger to the estate, and that, somehow, was worse than if they had been. A guard he paid, still in his shoulder rig, a napkin tucked absurdly into his collar, a young dockhand from the freight yards, no older than 19, frozen mid-laugh, a woman from the laundry with her sleeves pushed up. Old Novak, who had lied to his face 20 minutes ago, sitting at the corner with a bowl in front of him, and guilt all over his face. And at the far end, closest to the stove, an old man Emeric did not recognize at all. Thin, weathered, with a jaw Emeric knew from somewhere he couldn't yet place. In the center of it, at the head of a scarred wooden table that had no business existing in his marble house, stood Vesna, flower on her forearms, a wooden spoon in one hand. Her wide, warm face, open in the middle of a laugh that died the instant she saw him. For one long breath, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then his wife set the spoon down, wiped her hands slowly on her apron, and said, not frightened, not caught, just quiet, you're early, as though he were a guest. As though this, the smell, the strangers, the second table, hidden inside his own home, were the normal thing, and he were the intrusion. Emeric did not move from the doorway. He let his eyes do the work, while his face did nothing, the way he always did, cataloging the room, the way other men breathed, and what he cataloged did not fit any of the stories he'd built walking down the corridor. This was not a museum room. It was the only living room in the house. The kitchen he had surrendered 14 months ago and never entered had become something he had no word for. It was small and low-ceilinged and gold with lamplight. Bundles of drying herbs hung from a beam. A row of copper pots, dented and clearly used, hung by size above a stove that was actually warm. He could feel it from the door. There were mismatched chairs, more chairs than the room was built for, dragged in from somewhere. There was a loaf cooling on a rack, and a great dark pot breathing steam on the back burner, and the whole space smelled the way he imagined childhood was supposed to smell, and his own never had. And there were the people. That was the part his mind kept circling, and failing to file his guard, his dockhand, his laundress, his nightman, sitting, eating. In the deep, unhurried way of people who did this often, who had a place here, a chair that was theirs, a bowl that got filled without asking. The young dockhand had the specific stillness of a boy who has learned that fast movements get him hurt, and even he had, until 30 seconds ago, been laughing. Emeric had built loyalty, the only way he knew how. He paid for it. He frightened it into staying. He knew, with cold accuracy, exactly what each man in his organization would do for money, and exactly what each would do to avoid pain, and he ran his empire on the arithmetic between the two. He had never once, in 20 years, walked into a room of his own people and found them at ease. He looked at the guard with the napkin in his collar. The man went pale and started to rise, hand drifting toward the weapon. He suddenly seemed ashamed of. "Sit," Emeric said. The man sat. "How long?" Emeric asked the room softly, in the voice that made Harvard bosses pay early. "Has this been happening?" Silence. The dockhand looked at the table. The laundress looked at Vesna. Novak looked at his own hands. It was the old man at the end, the thin one, the one whose jaw Emeric almost knew. Who answered? His voice was a dry rasp, and he did not look away from Emeric the way the others did. He looked at him the way a man looks at someone he used to know. "Every night, Vantano," the old man said, "for a little over a year. Your wife has been feeding your people every night for a year, and you never once smelled it, because you decided a long time ago not to." Emeric turned his full attention to the stranger for the first time. And that was when he placed it, and felt the floor of his certain ordered world tilt under his polished shoes. Because the last time Emeric had seen that face, it had been in a photograph, on a list, under a single word his organization used for men who were gone and not coming back. Deceased. The old man watched him make the connection and smiled a thin, tired smile. "Hello, Emeric," said the man. "Everyone in Corvain Bay believed had been dead for 6 years. Your wife makes a better stew than your mother ever did. Sit down. We should talk about who's trying to kill you." Emeric did not sit down. Not at first. For a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath around the impossible old man, and Emeric felt every year of his discipline strain against the thing rising in his chest, because he knew that face now knew it completely. Tomas Rior, his father's oldest lieutenant, the man who had taught Emeric to read a room before he entered it, to count exits, to trust arithmetic over affection. The man who had vanished 6 years ago in the war that made Emeric king. Presumed betrayed, presumed drowned, presumed one more body the bay had swallowed. Emeric had ordered, the search called off himself. He had trusted the confirmation of the man who brought it to him. And here Tomas sat, spooning Vesna's stew in a warm gold room, alive. "Explain," Emeric said. It came out rougher than he intended. So they did, Vesna and the old man together, trading the story back and forth across the table, while the others sat very still. Tomas had not been killed 6 years ago. He had been sold, routed into a rival family's hands, by someone inside Emeric's own house, someone who had wanted the old lieutenant's council gone before Emeric came to power. He had spent the years since surviving in the margins of Corvain, too dangerous to surface, watching the boy he'd trained turn into a fortress of cold rooms. He had come back into the city 8 months ago, half-starved, with nothing left to trade but what he knew, and the only door in the entire Vantano Empire that had opened to him was this one, a kitchen, a wooden table. A woman with flour on her arms who asked no questions and filled a bowl. "I came to warn you," Tomas rasped. "I got as far as your gate and your men nearly put me in the ground for a beggar. So, I found the one Vantano who feeds people instead of burying them." He looked at Vesna with something close to reverence. "She's been keeping me breathing while I put the pieces together. And she's been feeding your soldiers, boy. Because a man who eats at your wife's table talks. Not because she asks, because she listens. You built an empire out of fear and never noticed it leaks. She built this out of bread, and everything in Corvain flows through it." Emeric turned to his wife. 14 months of a woman he had filed as decorative, soft, safely irrelevant, rearranged itself behind his eyes. "You knew," he said. "You knew who he was. You've been hiding a man I buried, in my house, for 8 months. "Yes," Vesna said. She did not flinch. She never had. That, he was only now understanding, had never been, because she failed to grasp the danger. It was because she had simply decided, long ago, that some things were worth more than being safe. You'd have shot him at the gate before he could say your father's name. So I fed him instead. And I fed your men, so that when the day came that you finally walked through that door, there'd be someone left in this house who'd tell you the truth. The truth, Emmerich repeated. The dockhand 19, trembling, brave, spoke for the first time. The dock, sir? There's a shipment coming Thursday that isn't yours. Men who aren't yours moving it. We've all seen pieces. We only ever say it here. He swallowed. Because here it's safe to say it. And there it was. The thing his money and his fear had never once bought him. Sitting in a room he'd been too proud to enter. The truth, freely given, over a bowl of stew. Someone inside his organization was moving against him. Someone who had done it before, 6 years ago, with Thomas. Someone close enough to route a shipment through his own harbor on a day he didn't know about. And the only reason Emmerich was hearing it at all was that his overlooked, dismissed, soft wife had spent 14 months building the one thing he had never fought to build, a place where his people were loved enough to warn him. Emmerich looked down the length of the warm little room, at the guard, the laundress, the boy, the old dead man, maid living, and last at Vesna, standing at the head of her table, with a wooden spoon and flour on her arms, watching him with those wide, unafraid eyes. For the first time in the 14 months of his marriage, for the first time, perhaps, in his whole armored life, Emmerich Fontano pulled out a chair. "Tell me everything," he said, and sat down at his wife's table. "Start with Thursday." He sat, and the room slowly began to breathe again around him. Vesna filled a bowl without being asked, and set it in front of him. Dark stew, a torn heel of bread beside it, and Emmerich looked at it for a long moment the way another man might look at a live wire. 14 months of throwing her plates in the bin, and here it was in front of him again, steaming, unavoidable. He did not pick up the spoon, not yet. He had questions that mattered more than his pride, and only one of them was about Thursday. "Why?" he said. He looked at his wife when he said it, and the word came out stripped of the cold he usually wrapped around everything. "Not the shipment you. You had every reason to want me dead. I ended your family. Your name is only Vantano, because mine erased what you were born as. And instead of putting a knife in me some night, you've spent a year feeding my soldiers soup." He shook his head slowly. "I don't understand you. I have never understood you. Explain it to me." For the first time all night, Vesna hesitated. Then she sat down across the corner of the table from him, closer than 16 empty chairs, and she told him she had not always been soft, she said. She had been made soft on purpose, the way a stone is made smooth, by everything hard that had happened to it. She was the last of the Orini family. The name Emmerich's father had spent Emmerich's youth destroying. She had watched it happen, from the inside. She had been 14 the winter. The war reached her grandmother's house, and while the men of her family died the way men in their world die, loud and armed and certain, it was her grandmother who had done the thing Vesna never forgot. She had kept cooking. Everything was ending, Vesna said quietly. Our people were frightened and hungry, and some of them were dying, and my grandmother stood at her stove and fed every single one who came to the door, ours, and toward the end even a few of yours who deserted and had nowhere warm to go. I asked her how she could feed the enemy, and she said," Vesna's voice did not break, but it went very careful, the way a voice goes when it is carrying something heavy across a long distance. She said, "A man you have fed is a man who has to decide, one more time, whether to hurt you. Most of them can't. That's the whole secret, child. That's the only power that was ever real." Her grandmother had died that winter. The house was gone. Vesna had survived the way the smooth stone survives, by being the thing that was left when everything sharp had been broken off. "When your people came to arrange the marriage," she went on, "everyone told me it was a surrender. My last humiliation. The Oreni girl handed over to the Vantano ice to seal the peace. She almost smiled, but I knew something they didn't. I knew what my grandmother knew. You gave me a kitchen to keep me quiet. You had no idea you'd handed me the only weapon I've ever wanted. Emmerich sat very still. He thought of the plates. 400 of them, carried past his door and thrown away, each one an offering he had treated as a threat. He thought of every night she had cooked for a house that despised the smell of it, for a husband who wouldn't taste it, for soldiers who couldn't say her name without a smirk, and how she had simply kept going, patient, unhurried, building her grandmother's slow, quiet power, one bowl at a time, in the belly of his cold house, asking him for nothing. He thought of what that must have cost. 14 months of warmth offered into a wall of ice, and never once withdrawn. You could have died 100 times over, he said. Hiding Tomas alone. If I'd found him before I understood, I know. Why risk it for my men? For an old man who served my family. Vesna looked at him then, and there was no fear in her at all, only something that had been waiting a very long time to be said. Because somebody in this house had to remember that people are worth more than they cost, she said. You'd forgotten. Your father made sure you'd forget. Somebody had to keep the pilot light burning until you were ready to see it. She nudged the bowl an inch closer to his hand. I never once thought you were cruel, Emmerich. I thought you were cold because you'd never been warm. Those aren't the same thing. One of them can be fixed. The steam rose off the bowl between them, and down the corridor, faint through the warmth, came a sound that did not belong, the front gate's heavy bolt, drawing back at an hour when no one should have been arriving. Emmerich's head turned. Thomas went still, and into the sudden silence of the warm gold room, the old man said one low word. Ren Osgar Ren had been Emmerich's underboss for 11 years. He was the man who carried the ledgers, who knew the shipping routes, who signed for the dead when Emmerich did not want his own name on a list. He had a soft handshake and a good memory, and he had stood at Emmerich's right hand at the funeral of every man they'd buried together, including, 6 years ago, the empty coffin they'd lowered for Tomas Rior. He's coming up the drive, the guard reported from the kitchen doorway, low and fast, the napkin gone from his collar and his weapon out now. Ren and 4 men, he said. You sent for a strategy meeting. Emmerich rose from the table, and here was the moment the old Emmerich would have recognized. The cold arithmetic clicking into place, the plan assembling itself. Handle it the careful way. Meet Ren in the marble hall with a smile. Learn what he knew, give nothing away, and deal with the betrayal later, quietly, in a manner of Emmerich's own choosing. Protect the operation, protect the empire, reveal nothing. It was the way he had survived 20 years, and it would work now. He looked at the warm room instead, at Tomas, a dead man, his own right hand had sold. At the boy taller, 19 and shaking, and brave enough to speak the truth over a bowl of stew. At the laundress, at Novak, at the guard, who had eaten here and would rather die than see this room touched. At Vesna, standing at the head of her table with her sleeves pushed back, watching him decide who he was going to be. The careful way meant hiding this room. It meant sending them all back to their stations, sweeping the warmth under the marble, meeting Ren as the Ice King, and pretending the door at the end of the West Corridor had never opened. It meant protecting his empire by protecting the very thing that had rotted it, the silence, the fear, the cold. Emmerich Vantano had thrown away 400 plates. He was done throwing things away. For a moment he let himself feel the full weight of it, not the tactical weight, the other kind. Every man in this warm room had at some point come to his door as a number, a wage, a risk, a liability to be managed. His father had taught him to see people that way, and he had been an apt student. He had run an empire of numbers for 20 years, and it had never once occurred to him that a number could not love you back, could not warn you, could not stand in a doorway and take a hit meant for someone else. Vesna had looked at the same men and seen none of that arithmetic. She had seen people who were hungry, and she had fed them, and somewhere in the feeding, they had stopped being his and quietly become hers. He understood. Now, it was the hardest thing he had ever seen anyone do, and he was finished, pretending otherwise. No, he said, and the word came out with a finality that made even Tomas look up. We don't hide this. We don't sweep it under. He wants a strategy meeting? A thin, dangerous thing moved across Americ's face. Not the cold mask, but something new underneath it, something with heat in it. Then we'll have one, right here. Emeric, Tomas said carefully, if you bring Ren into this room, he'll know in one look that you know. There's no walking that back. Whatever you do tonight, you do it in front of witnesses, at your wife's table, with no way to unsay it. I know exactly what it means. Emeric was already moving, low and certain, positioning them. The guard here, Novak to the door, the boy behind Vesna. It means, for the first time in 11 years, Oscar Wren is going to sit down at a table where the food was made by someone who loves the people eating it, and he's going to find out what that costs a man like him. He looked at his wife. Your grandmother was right. A man you fed has to decide, one more time, whether to hurt you. His jaw set. Let's find out what Wren decides. Outside, 4 car doors closed in the dark, one after another, like the cocking of a gun. They did not run. That was the first thing Wren noticed. And it was the first thing that frightened him. He came in through the marble hall the way he always did, easy and smiling, his men fanning out behind him, and found the great cold house not cold at all. He found it lit at the far end, warm, and he found Novak waiting to lead him not to the study where business was done, but down the west corridor, to a door Oscar Wren had never in 11 years seen open. He stepped into the gold room and stopped as though he'd walked into glass. Because there was Emeric at the head of a small worn table, unhurried, a bowl of stew in front of him, and there, at the old man's place near the stove, spooning that same stew with a steady hand, was a face Oscar Wren had personally arranged to disappear 6 years ago. Oscar? Emeric said pleasantly. Sit. You'll want to try the bread to his credit. Wren was good. The smile barely flickered. Emeric, I don't. Who is your guest? You know exactly who he is. You signed the coffin. Emeric gestured to the empty chair across the table, and it was not a request. Sit, eat. We're going to talk about Thursday and the shipment that isn't mine, and how a man moves cargo through my harbor on a day I don't know about. He picked up his spoon at last, and ate, the first bite of his wife's cooking he had taken in 14 months, and did not take his eyes off Wren while he did it. And you're going to do it here at this table, where my people can hear you. That was the thing Wren had no plan for. He had built his entire treachery on the architecture of Emeric's coldness, on the fact that Emeric kept everyone at arm's length, that the empire ran on isolated men who never compared notes, that fear kept mouths shut. Wren had operated in the gaps between people, and now Emeric had done the one thing Wren had never imagined the Ice King could do. He had gathered them. He had put a guard, a dockhand, a laundress, an old dead lieutenant, and a wife around a single table and called it his war room, and in that warm, crowded room there were no gaps left for Wren to hide in. Over the next hour, the table did what the table did. It talked. Not because Emeric threatened anyone, because for once he didn't have to. Taller, steadier now with Vesna's hand on his shoulder, laid out what the dockhands had seen. The night crews rotated off Pier 9. The manifests that didn't match, the men with the wrong accents. The laundress described the coats she'd cleaned, whose they were, the harbor grit in the cuffs. Novak remembered a car. Thomas fit each piece into 6 years of patient watching, and the shape that assembled itself on the worn wood, bowl by bowl and voice by voice, was a map of Oscar Wren's entire operation. The routes, the buyers, the rival family bankrolling him. The plan to bleed the Vontano freight lines dry from the inside, exactly as he'd begun to do 6 years before, by removing the one man who might have seen it coming. Emeric ate his wife's stew and watched his empire's soft, warm, uncounted infrastructure, lay his most trusted man bare, and understood at last what she had built, while he despised the smell of it. Not a kitchen, a nervous system. A place where everything the Empire's fear had frozen could finally thaw and move and speak. "You see, Osgar," Emmerich said quietly, setting down his spoon, "I spent 20 years believing loyalty was something you bought or something you frightened into a man. And it turns out the whole time there was a cheaper way and a truer one happening at the end of my own hallway. My wife has been running a better intelligence network than you and I combined. She did it with bread." He almost smiled. "You should have eaten here more often. You might have remembered how to be a person." Ren's hand moved, a small, practiced motion toward his coat. Every man he'd brought was in the marble hall. Every man in this room was Emmerich's. "I wouldn't," said the guard, with the napkin gone from his collar, and Ren went still. Emmerich rose. "Take his men in the hall, quietly. I don't want a scene on the marble. It's a nuisance to clean." He came around the table, and now the heat under the cold was fully in his face. "And Osgar comes with me to the study. He and I have 6 years to discuss." Ren stood slowly, caught, ashen. And then, because a cornered man will always reach for the softest thing in the room, his eyes went past Emmerich to Vesna, at the head of her table. "The Oreni girl," he said, and made it a sneer. "Of course, you went soft over a little kitchen mouse who," he never finished it, not because Emmerich struck him, because from the marble hall came a sudden flat crack, and then another, and the sound of Ren's men, who had not after all come only for the house Emmerich had built to hear his own footsteps, in betrayed him now with echoes. 2 cracks, then chaos. Ren's men in the hall had been the smaller half of the plan. The rest had come over the east wall in the dark, while their master kept everyone's eyes on the drive, and now they were inside, and the cold marble corridors that Emmerich had designed to leave nowhere to hide worked exactly as well for the men hunting him as they had ever worked for him. But they did not know the house the way its warmth did. "The kitchen," Emmerich ordered, low and fast, hauling Ren by the collar as a shield and a prisoner both. "It's the only room with one door and a wall to your back. Move. Move." And the strange little company that his wife had assembled over 14 patient months moved as one, the guard covering the corridor, Novak throwing bolts, Toller half carrying the laundress, Thomas, old but unhurried, a man who had survived 6 years in the margins and knew precisely how to make himself small. They made the warm gold room. The guard slammed the heavy door, oiled. Emmerich thought again absurdly. She kept it oiled, and through the bar. Vesna had of course long ago had fitted, because a woman hiding a dead man for 8 months. Plans for the night the hiding ends. Then the fight came to the door. It was short, and it was ugly, the way real ones are. The rival family's men were professionals, but they were pushing into a single doorway, held by men who were not defending an empire or a paycheck. They were defending the one room in Corvain Bay where they had been fed without being counted. There is no one so dangerous as a person protecting the place that first made him feel like a person. And the men in the warm room stood like that, all of them. Even the boy. Especially the boy. When one of Ren's men forced the door and swung his weapon toward Vesna, toward the head of the table, toward the woman with flowers still on her arms, it was Toller who put himself in the gap. 19 years old, a dockhand who, 3 hours ago, had been afraid to say a true thing out loud, standing between a gun and the first person who had ever fed him for free. He took the hit, meant for her. And Emmerich, who had watched men fall for 20 years without his pulse changing, felt something tear open in his chest as the boy went down and moved. What Emmerich von Tano did in the next 90 seconds, the survivors would not fully agree on afterward. But when it was over, the last of Ren's men were down, and Emmerich stood in the sudden quiet, breathing hard, and the warm room behind him was still standing, still whole, still hers. Toller was alive. The shot had gone through his shoulder, Vesna was already on the floor beside him with a clean towel and steady hands, and that low, unhurried voice, and the boy was white and shaking and alive. Oscar Wren was on his knees in the middle of the kitchen, disarmed, held. The room went quiet. Emmerich crossed to him, slowly. He crouched to Wren's level, and for a long moment he simply looked at the man who had sold Thomas 6 years ago, who had come tonight to finish the job on all of them, who had, at the very end, reached for the softest thing in the room and sneered at Emmerich's wife. "You had it backward your whole life, Oscar," Emmerich said, very quietly. "You thought the cold rooms were where the power was. You thought the way to own men was to keep them frightened and apart and hungry." He glanced back once, at the boy on the floor, who had taken a hit for a woman he was not related to, at the old dead man, made living by a bowl of stew, at the guards and staff who had held the line for a table. But this is where it was. The whole time, in the one room I was too proud to walk into, he stood. She fed the men you thought were mine, and they turned out to be hers. That's the difference between us. That's the difference that just cost you everything. He did not do it in the warm room. He would not finish it where his wife made bread, and a boy was being tended on the floor. He nodded to the guard, and Wren was taken out to the cold marble hall where the Ice King's old business had always been done, and there, in the room built for footsteps and echoes, Emmerich Ventano settled a 6-year-old debt. When he came back, it was done, and he did not pretend otherwise. He crossed the warm gold room to his wife, who was still on the floor, with the boy's head steadied in her lap, and her chin up, and no fear in her at all, and he knelt down beside her. "Tell me what you need," said the coldest man in Corvain Bay. To save him, Dawn came into a house that had changed overnight, though from the outside it looked exactly the same. Taller lived. Vesna's steady hands and Tomas's old field knowledge held him together until the family doctor arrived, and by the gray hour before sunrise, the boy was tended and dosed, and asleep in a real bed, in the East Wing, in one of the fine guest rooms Emmerich had built to impress men he despised. Because Emmerich had carried him there himself, and would not hear otherwise. Wren's rival backers received their answer at first light. 2 cars returned to their harbor with a single message folded on the seat, and by noon every dock in Corvain Bay understood that the Ventano lines were not, after all, going to bleed quietly from the inside, and that the Ice King had somehow impossibly grown warmer and more dangerous in the same night. But that was the Empire's morning. The house's morning happened in the kitchen, and Merrick found her there, of course. Where else? The gold room in daylight was smaller and shabbier and more beautiful than it had been by lamplight. The dented copper, the drying herbs, the scarred table with its too many chairs. Vesna stood at the stove with flour on her arms, because the household still had to be fed, because that was the one thing that did not stop for war or grief or dawn. She had been awake all night. She looked it. She had never looked better to him. He did not know how to say what he had come to say, so he said the true thing, which he was still learning to do. "I threw away 400 of your plates," Emmerich said. "I want to tell you why, and I want you to know it isn't an excuse." He set his hands flat on the back of a chair. Her chair, the one at the head. "I was raised by a man who taught me that anything I loved was a way to hurt me. So I made sure I loved nothing. Not food, not comfort, not." His voice did the careful thing hers had done last night, carrying something heavy across a long way. "Not my wife. And you sat at the far end of my table for 14 months and offered me the exact thing I'd trained my whole life to refuse. And you never stopped, even when I was cruel, with the not stopping. Why didn't you ever stop?" Vesna set down her spoon. She came around the table to him, close, closer than 16 empty chairs, close as she'd been the night before, and she put one flour-dusted hand flat against his chest, over the place where 20 years of cold was, at long last, cracking. "Because I could feel it," she said simply, "right here, Under all that ice, still warm, just banked, like a fire someone had covered so it wouldn't go out. Her wide, unafraid eyes held his. My grandmother could keep a coal alive under 3 inches of ash for a whole winter. I learned from the best. I was never feeding your soldiers, Emmerich, not really. I was feeding you. One covered plate at a time, until you were ready to lift the cloth. The coldest man in Corvain Bay stood in a warm kitchen at dawn, and for the first time since a winter he barely remembered, let himself be warmed. He pulled out her chair, the one at the head of the table, and he held it for her, the way, in 14 months, he had never once thought to do. And then he sat down in the chair beside it, in the seat that had been empty, the one that was, it turned out, always his. Teach me the bread, Emmerich said. Start with why Baptiste never rests the veal. And Vesna Vantano, the last of the Orini, the girl from the burned house, the woman his whole world had dismissed as soft, laughed her low, warm laugh, the one he now got to hear every day for the rest of his life, and reached for the flower. They never did eat in the great marble hall again. The 18-seat table went into storage. The orchids stopped coming. Within a month, everyone in the Vantano house, the guards, the staff, the men who ran the harbor, the boy Toller with his arm in a sling and his chin held high, knew that the real business of the empire, the true center of it, was a scarred wooden table in a warm gold room at the end of the west corridor, where the food was made by a woman who loved the people eating it, and where a man learned everything he needed to know because his people were finally warm enough to tell him. Thomas Rior came back from the dead officially and sat at his old lieutenant's place and taught the boy Toller to read a room. Emeric Vantano ruled Corvain Bay for another 30 years, and was feared and was also, quietly, to the astonishment of everyone who had known his father loved. And every night of those 30 years, without fail, he ate at his wife's table. He never threw away another plate, because Emmerich didn't win. The night Osgar Wren came over the wall. He won the day he finally opened a door he'd kept closed for 14 months and found out that while he'd been building a fortress out of fear, his overlooked, dismissed, underestimated wife had been building something stronger out of bread and patience. And that, my friends, is how a woman with a wooden spoon conquered a kingdom of knives. If this story warms something in you, if you believe the quiet ones are always the ones holding the whole house together, then do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories where the overlooked turn out to be the strongest in the room, and tell me down in the comments, what was your favorite moment? The night he opened the door, the boy who took the bullet, or the cold king who finally sat down? I'll see you at the next table.